And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Great to have on today Delano Squires from the Heritage Foundation. Delano, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Well, I've met Delano about 2 years ago. We've had some just great conversations about family formation, about fatherhood, and certainly anyone that's paying attention to culture knows we're facing a massive challenge in the family. And so I wanted to dive in. Delano's done some great work in this area, especially addressing the black family, addressing the impact of feminism, as well as the welfare system, all things that we need to be thinking about as Christian citizens. So if you're unfamiliar with Delano's work, he's the director of the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Human Flourishing, where he focuses on policies and social norms that promote marriage, fatherhood, and healthy families. He's the author of the book, The Vanishing Black Family, How Welfare and Feminism Made Marriage Optional and Children Vulnerable. His writings have been published in a number of places: Newsweek, National Review, The American Conservative, The Federalist, the Institute for Family Studies, Black Enterprise, Blaze Media, and the Griot. Before joining Heritage, he worked for the District of Columbia, the government there, for more than a decade. I really appreciate that experience. And during that time, he ran a citywide technology program. He earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Engineering from the University of Pittsburgh, graduate degree from the George Washington University. He resides there in Maryland with his wife and 4 kids. Delano, if you would, maybe just jump in as we get started to share just a recent success story or maybe a meaningful moment that's been impacting you recently.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a recent, still fairly recent, meaningful moment for me is just honestly being able to spend the holidays, the most recent holidays, Christmas in particular, with my family back in New York. It's been a long time since we've traveled back to New York, and my parents were there, my sister, brother-in-law, my nephew, and then my extended family. Because I'm one of these people that really believes the adage that it takes a village to raise a child. But unlike Hillary Clinton, like my village never included the government, whether state, local, or federal. So, I mean, we were in the house with probably 40, 50 people, relatives, church family, godchildren, godparents, everyone sort of communing together and enjoying each other's company. And that to me really hit home in terms of like why I do the work that I do, is to restore that type of tight-knit community, that family, to restore that to the forefront of American culture. So that really was a good experience for me. It was great for the kids. They got to see their god brothers and sisters and play and have fun, and we got to reminisce, and me and my friends got to tell old war stories of getting into mischief as kids, and everybody really just had a good time.
Well, I so appreciate that example of just rich, thick community. I remember an article in The Atlantic a while back that talked about how the nuclear family was never intended to make us thrive. And at first I thought, well, this is another attack on the family. But you get into it more, and we have a technology futurist on our board, and he talks about the dishwasher as something that impacted the American family. And it set a bomb, and the kids washing the dishes to talk. He talks about the garage door opener and how it closes. You don't have conversations, the disappearing front porch. And so that made a lot more sense. We were never intended to just be the nuclear family, and I think the New Testament talks about the church as that community as well. So let's jump into your story. How did your personal background, including upbringing, family life, you've shared a little bit about that already, but how did that drive you towards the work that you do today?
So at some point, probably in my teenage years, again, I grew up in New York and in Queens. Most of my friends live in Brooklyn. I went to church in Brooklyn. And when me and my 3 best friends would be together at men's fellowship with our dads, we would sometimes start to talk about, okay, why is it that our lives look so much different than the guys we knew, whether from the playground, from the neighborhood, from school, many of whom were getting into trouble, whether it's formal sort of gang activity or neighborhood crews, but they were getting into trouble of one type or another. And eventually we came to the conclusion, like, we all were growing up in homes with married parents, fathers in the home, and not just our individual dads, but we had a community of men within our church who were raising us, who were teaching us values and morals and biblical principles, who made sure that we worked. So when the church purchased an apartment building next door and wanted to make it into an annex, we were the demolition crew. Now, we couldn't build anything, but we could certainly destroy some things. And if you give 4 teenage boys sledgehammers and you tell them to go to work and promise a hearty meal at the end, you'll get some work done. So from a fairly early age, I realized that what really made my life different was the fact that I was born to married parents in a large sort of extended family, and then again a larger sort of church community, and that all these people had a hand in raising me and shaping me. And I was not a perfect kid by any stretch of the imagination, but I would only go but so far. The Bible says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he gets old, he won't depart from it. And I've seen that play out in my life and in the lives of my friends and loved ones. So I think that's where it really started for me. And then going off to school and learning and seeing how other people lived and different ways of organizing family, I really began to see, there is a difference there. I see a difference between my peers who come from strong, stable 2-parent homes and my peers who do not. That doesn't mean that we couldn't all be successful. It just means some people had additional challenges. And then going forward into my professional work, working in D.C. government for almost 15 years, almost exclusively in public-facing roles, right, doing work in low-income communities and public housing. My last year in the city was with the Office of Gun Violence Prevention, and seeing the statistics in terms of both victims and perpetrators of crime, and understanding that both sides of the ledger, because it was often the same people, right? Typically young, black, male, oftentimes, coming from broken homes. I could see those connections between family structure and social outcomes even clearer. So it's a combination, sort of personal background and professional experience has brought me to the place I am today.
So, Delano, I know we shared some things in common. I did not know teenage demolition crew at the church was one of them. Because when my church was, we were trying to sell a building, they had sledgehammers and they even had a jackhammer in there. And I'm not sure how exactly safe it was to let some teenage boys manage the jackhammer. But we had to destroy this massive concrete floor to sell it. And we had a hearty meal afterwards. So
see?
For any church leaders out there, you didn't know you were going to get that today. But certainly this has also mirrored my experience in so many discussions as a family law attorney, working at a church, and then now working with legislators and just asking them over and over again, what is the worst problem in your district? Across ideological lines, doesn't matter what's behind your name, same framing, the breakdown of the family. And so this is no surprise, but one that we don't talk about enough, and why I'm so glad that you're focused on it. So you've described a little bit into your professional life. What specifically drew you to Heritage, and maybe describe a little bit of your role there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. At some point, probably in my late 20s, I thought to myself, you know what, I'd love to be a political or social commentator online. I'd love to work at a think tank, right? I had applied to think tanks probably in my mid-20s. Now, they tended to be left of center. I never expected to be at a conservative think tank, but I think what drew me is that over the years, I began to deepen in my faith. I began to grow in my knowledge and love of the Lord, and I started to become more and more uncomfortable with the idea that I would have certain faith commitments or beliefs in sort of one hand, and then I would have certain political and social beliefs in another hand. And I just wanted to close the space between those two things as much as possible. So I wasn't planning on coming to a think tank, but eventually my time at D.C. government came to a close. But prior to that, again, I had been writing about issues of, faith and family and marriage, fatherhood, culture, for quite some time. Both outlets on the political left, so the Root and the Griot, as well as ones on the political right, the Federalists and the Blaze. And I had the privilege of being able to speak to Dr. Kevin Roberts on his podcast prior to coming to Heritage. And we talked for about an hour about faith, fatherhood, and family. And so when my time at DC government came to an end, and it was an abrupt end, I didn't know, when my last day would be. I was able to make a fairly smooth transition to the Heritage Foundation. And thankfully, under Dr. Roberts' leadership, the future of the American family has become one of our pillars here at the Heritage Foundation. So it's not just something that we talk about tangentially. It's like, no, this is one of our focus areas is on strengthening the American family so that the next 250 years of American history can be as great or greater than the 250 years to this point. And the only way we can do that is by ensuring that our families are as strong as possible.
That's so encouraging. Now, you've worked on a number of different reports, but I'd like to maybe dive into one or two of those. Certainly revisiting the Moynihan report or addressing family breakdown, and maybe for listeners, certainly mention what is that Moynihan report, its importance, and then how revisiting it's important today.
Yeah, so people know of the Moynihan report sort of colloquially, but the report was on the I think it was entitled "The Negro Family: A Case for National Action." That was the official title of the report. This is in 1965, March of 1965. Daniel Patrick Moynihan was then the Assistant Labor Secretary under Lyndon Baines Johnson, President Johnson, and he wrote a report on the state of the black family, which he believed was in a state of emergency. He looked at certain statistics, and particularly the 25% out of wedlock birth rate, and he saw family breakdown as one issue that would prevent African Americans from taking full advantage of sort of the gains of the Civil Rights era. So that's the Civil Rights Act in 1964, Voting Rights Act in 1965, legislation to outlaw discrimination in housing and public accommodations and education. And Moynihan said two things. He said there'd be two reasons why these new laws would not lead to the types of social equality that civil rights activists were hoping for. One, he described as the remaining racism in the American bloodstream. I'm paraphrasing, but part of it was like racism working itself out of American culture over decades. And then the second one was the breakdown of the family. And again, he pointed to certain statistics to make that case. And he tried to explain how the black family came to the position that it was. Now, 25% out of wedlock birth rate sounds extremely high compared to what it was nationally, which was probably, I want to say somewhere around 8% nationally. Among white families, the non-marital birth rate at that time was about 2 to 3%. So the overwhelming majority of children, particularly white children in America, were born to married parents. And still the majority of children black children were born to married parents. But 25% was fairly high. I decided to revisit that because I realized that Moynihan was quite prophetic. And he said if family structure is not addressed, primarily through work, not welfare. He wasn't saying that welfare was the solution. He said if family structure was not addressed, that the issues of social pathology would begin to replicate over the course of generations, and things would get increasingly worse for black families. And I think in many respects, particularly as it relates to family formation, he was exactly correct. So in 1965, again, 1 out of 4 black children was born to unmarried parents. By the mid-70s, it crossed 50%. And by the late 90s, it reached around 70%. And it's been at or around 70% for the better part of, 25 to 30 years. So what we saw with that particular issue, we are seeing now across the board, because now 40% of all American children are born to unmarried parents. And the only major ethnic group that's below that Moynihan threshold, what I call that 25%, are Asian American families at about 13%. So This is an issue where you see, black families were really the canary in the coal mine. But now family breakdown is a national concern. And I think that's one of the reasons you see so many conservative politicians, policymakers, think tanks really taking it up as something to address and moving forward.
And certainly we're seeing that at the federal level, also at the state level with several states passing essentially just the success sequence. Listeners are probably familiar with that. Graduate high school, get married, have children. And if you follow that, you generally end up middle class. It was amazing, the floor debate on that particular issue of just almost claims that teaching the success sequence was somehow discriminatory or something, and just trying to have that conversation. And it just underlined to me how far we have to go to get back to just teaching family structure and that success sequence. Well, you've written a book, and as we dive into this, I did want to mention we talk about strengthening the American family. We believe this is a created order issue. We're all created equal in God's eyes. There are certainly these cultural distinctives, but in the work that you're doing, Delano, specifically in the black family, I've seen it certainly in more rural communities with certainly lower socioeconomic groups in the white community. And so we look at this, but I think we can learn from one another as we study it. But you did put pen to paper on a topic, that the vanishing black family, how welfare and feminism made marriage optional and children vulnerable. Could you maybe hit the thesis of that book and maybe a couple key points that
Sure.
you've been thinking about?
Sure, and I should say that the book is available for pre-order now. The published date is June 16th of this year. But the thesis of the book is that the black family, the traditional black family, husband, wife, raising their biological children, is on the verge of extinction. And this is an issue that is ignored by civil rights groups, racial justice activists, progressives on the left who say that they care about equality. And this is an issue that's both ignored and has its roots in, again, the 1960s, where I talk about the rise of big government liberalism through the welfare state, as well as the rise of second wave feminism. So part of the book, half of the book is assessing where we are today and how we got here. And then the second half of the book is laying out a clear plan for how we move forward. So I call for a new movement of marriage revival and family restoration. So I spend, again, the second half of the book talking about what that will require, what that would require, including reframing the issue of family restoration for key institutions and reframing it around the needs and rights of children, not the desires of adults. So I talk about that. I talk about the fact that the church has to be in the lead for this because, as you said, this is really an issue of created order. And what is needed for the black family is the same thing that's needed for every other family, which is making right the relationship between man, woman, and the God who created the institution of marriage. The reason we are where we are today, across the board with American families, is because we've lost that relationship, and we've rejected God's design and assumed that we know how to make family in our own way and in our own image, and we've seen how that's failed. So I talk about reframing the issue for key institutions. I talk about removing political obstacles. One of the points that I make in the book is that family restoration, particularly in the black community, is going to be opposed by groups that many people will not expect. I talk about opposition from paternalists, so these are big government liberals, from feminists, from LGBT activists, from anti-racists, and from abortionists. So these are all groups that claim to be allies of the black community, but really have a vested interest in seeing families remain broken and torn apart. I talk about rejecting destructive media because I believe that culture is just as, if not more important than policy when it comes to the ideas that shape us, our values, our morals are shaped by culture. And you can't promote a culture that sows discord between the sexes, whether through film, television, or music, and then expect to have, families that are forming in a healthy manner. And in the last chapter, I ready marriage advocates for battle. And I think that one is important to say, look, this is going to be a fight. This is a multi-generational project to restore a biblical design to the household. And obviously you and I know that every person who gets married, every couple that gets married is not Christian, but I talk about marriage as a common grace of God. So created by God, but enjoyed by people, even, couples that don't believe in God. In the same way that someone could live in a home and not know who designed it or who built it. But they're reaping the benefits of a structure that someone else created according to a blueprint that someone else designed. So that's really sort of the gist of the book. So the first half is about the problems, how we got here. Again, I start with slavery. I go to welfare, feminism, the failure of black leaders, and specifically how the black church, a very influential subset of black churches, have traded biblical fidelity for political power, which makes them an obstacle to family restoration and not an ally. And then the second half, as I said, is all about solutions and how we move our way forward. So the book is part cultural critique, part call to action. But not to toot my own horn, but I think it promises to be the most consequential analysis of the black family since the Moynihan Report, and what I hope to be the most consequential book on race in recent memory.
Well, and looking forward to having that link in the show notes and seeing that come out, diving in. I want to double click on a few things here. And the first one is the church. And we've had some good conversations about this. And my approach on the podcast is just kind of dive into topics. And certainly in the church itself, we're going to talk about a movement now to kind of recapture the importance of marriage. And certainly we see that some of the failure has to be laid at the feet of the church for not kind of standing up for biblical principles. I'd be interested in any thoughts on specifically how that kind of iterated in the black church. So in my context, I realize that a lot of our churches trying to, have people there on Sunday morning, we've kind of tiptoed around marriage. We talk a lot about same-sex marriage, but we haven't really hammered, hey, you need to be married, you need to stay married. If you're not married and you're living together. I saw a pastor this week had spoken on this, and I think 60 couples in his church actually have come forward, and they're going to do some sort of like mass wedding. And I'm like, this is the way, But I would just be interested in your specific context. Are there any specific things that had iterated there from the church's perspective?
Yeah, so let me start with the good. All right? I know a number of churches, and these are majority black churches, some in the D.C. area, I know some in the Deep South, that are doing really good work in this area, in this space. My wife and I went to a post-marital education class, right? So this was for newlyweds at a pretty large church here in Maryland, the suburbs of D.C. And it was really good. It was taught by a couple who's been married for well over a decade, and it gave us some really good tools. And that church, I think, has shown a commitment to helping couples both prior to and after they get married build strong relationships, right? I can say similar about a church that I know in South Carolina, Spartanburg, South Carolina, that has worked with cohabiting couples and moved them from shacking up to settling down, right? And I think you see this, and you can see this across the country in different regions and different churches. So that's the good. The bad and the ugly is that the churches who the media is most likely to go to when they want to hear from the black church, quote unquote, which typically coincides with election cycles. So it's every 4 years. CNN, MSNBC, even Fox will show up at a black church and talk about the election, talk about getting souls to the polls, talk about presidential candidates and public policy issues. And the bad is when those churches speak more about, whatever's on a presidential candidate's policy agenda than they do about marriage, family, children, life. Like these, I'm talking about Genesis issues. So there are churches that will again talk about getting souls to the polls, but but they won't talk about what is required of a man and woman as it relates to getting married and forming a family. The ugly is, I'm thinking about, again, a subset of these churches, the most politically active churches that function as, cupbearers, religious cupbearers for the progressive left.
Wow.
These are the churches that cannot aid in the revival of the black family because defining marriage from a biblical perspective, they would see as oppressive to the marginalized LGBT community. And what I write in the book is that this really started with the liberation theology that was pushed by Dr. James Cone, sort of post, 1960s civil rights era, which doesn't take a biblical approach to these issues, right? In terms of righteous, unrighteous, right or wrong, sin, or again, God's holiness. It's oppressed oppressor. So in this sense, if I say that marriage is strictly between a man and a woman, someone who holds the liberation theology would say, well, that is an oppressive application of doctrine or misapplication of biblical doctrine that is oppressive to marginalized same-sex couples or LGBT or transgender. And those are the people who I think who tend to be very active politically, tend to think about the black church's role primarily as a political institution, not as a spiritual institution. Those are the ones who stand in the way of progress in this particular area. So I write about that, and I say how these churches traded the appearance of social justice for biblical fidelity. And as I said, makes them an obstacle to rebuilding the family and not a needed ally.
That phrase that you used there, a cupbearer for the progressive left, it's certainly true across the board into white churches as well. Being careful of some of these, critical theories coming in and individuals using the Bible, and this happens, we see it at the State House, in court cases, etc., using an interpretation of the Bible to support something that Scripture is clearly against.
Right.
And that's where I've tried to just fall back, as you've mentioned already, just the created order. Either we believe this is how God created the world, and it's not bigotry to ask people to follow God's good design, knowing that that's how they're actually going to flourish. And in fact, it's a lack of compassion not to emphasize that. And some of the stats that you've shared in a number of issues, I'm somewhat relieved. Like, the evidence is in. All right, there's no question. All right, the way that the American family is right now, the current status is certainly not working. I don't think anyone would say, hey, we're in a good spot. And hopefully this can help us call folks back to that biblical, Genesis 1 type of standard. So you mentioned some about the church. I did want to double click next on feminism. And some of the things that you've said on the podcast already, I'm grateful for them. They're certainly courageous. I'm sure there's some folks that come after you for saying them. So how did feminism come into this equation?
So one of the things that I argue in the book is that any understanding of changes in family dynamics deals with at least one of three sort of foundational issues: men, women, and the institution of marriage. So when I looked at sort of this rise of the welfare state, I argued that welfare displaced men from their homes and displaced them from their God-given role as providers for their family. When I talk about particularly the rise of second-wave feminism, I argue that feminism deceived women, specifically by selling women on the idea that femininity is weak, masculinity is toxic, marriage is oppressive, the home is a prison, and children are a burden. And I think when I sort of unpack the ideas of both the Gloria Steinems and the Betty Friedan's and the way that they talked about sort of domestic life, marriage, and family, that's evident. But I go a little deeper and I talk about the sort of advent of black feminism, or sometimes some people might call it womanism, as a distinct political philosophy, which piggybacks on some of the goals of mainstream feminism, right? So this is more education and financial independence for women, but has the added race element, which groups patriarchy and capitalism together, and patriarchy, capitalism, and racism as sort of the three-strand cord that keeps black women bound. So what you see from many of the black feminists, so Audre Lorde, Alice Walker, Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, Kimberly Crenshaw, is sort of an attack on marriage, but really an attack on men. And what they'll flip-flop. And in one instance, they'll say that, men are our allies in the fight to, rid us of patriarchy. And then they'll also, castigate men for not being protective of black women. So it's an interesting sort of evolution in terms of how, second wave feminism had an impact on the black family. And again, I think what made it so powerful is that these two things were happening at the same exact time, right? Both mid-'60s, the rise of the welfare state and the rise of second wave feminism, to the point where there were black feminists, and I'm thinking of Eleanor Holmes Norton, who's represented D.C. in Congress, a non-voting member for well over 30 years, and she wrote an essay in the Black Woman's Manifesto in the early 70s where she basically said that, women who are staying at home and reading bedtime stories to their children and not taking up the work of the revolution are not going to make it. So there was a way in which they were mocking, traditional family life. But she wrote that in the early 1970s. By 1985 or 86, she wrote an essay for the New York Times titled, "It's Time to Restore the Traditional Black Family." And I think what she realized is that what she was selling in the early 70s would not lead to the type of flourishing or social economic gains that she was hoping for. And I at least appreciated the course correction. I also acknowledged that the New York Times would not run that story today. They wouldn't run that essay. They wouldn't publish that essay because many of the mainstream media organs have been captured by sort of feminist doctrine and, in fact, read anything that promotes the traditional family as being a threat to the gains and rights and freedoms won by women.
That's super helpful. And I know in the book you're going to you listed off so many names. I'm looking forward to, going back and reviewing those. I know many of them would be mentioned in the book as well. So this other factor you talked about would be the welfare state, kind of looping all three in maybe, and certainly back to the church. I so often hear Matthew 25 used to say, hey, we should care for the poor, we should care for the prisoner, not specifying the distinction between the church and the state, and how so often those that have studied the concept of toxic charity, how these things can actually have adverse effects, even though maybe intentions are good going in. So how did welfare play into this?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that conservatives talk about often, right? It's how the rise of the welfare state basically paid low-income women to have children out of wedlock. And one of the things that I think policymakers often do is that they'll start with the intent of a particular policy, and then that's as far as they go. They don't look at the impact, or if they do look at the impact and they see the impact does not match intent, they just do a little bit of historical revisionism and say, well, that's not really what we wanted. But just as important, another eye that's just as important is the incentive structure. And in the 1960s, when welfare was expanded and the rules were loosened, married couples in many states were not eligible for welfare at all. And then there was a question of whether a woman who had, let's say, a boyfriend who visited her frequently whether he should be counted as a quote-unquote substitute father for the purposes of her welfare application. Now, the Supreme Court sort of struck down this man in the house rule in 1968. But what I argue in the book is that the government had no problem playing a substitute father, and that's both through elected officials and unelected bureaucrats. So what you see is a rapid expansion of social welfare programs. In 1950, it was about $1 billion on social welfare programs. By 1985, I think we had hit over $60 billion. And what I argue is that the government's willingness to step in, they would say step in this instance, displace men from their God-given role of providing for their families. So not only did it create an incentive for women to not be married when they had children, it also created an incentive for men who understood that if they stepped away, somebody else would step in and take their place. And this started with low-income families, but it sent a signal, a cultural signal, that it is not the responsibility of a man to take care of the children that he creates and brings into this world. And that cultural signal has had a ripple throughout our culture, not just in low-income communities, but I think it sort of loosened those bonds. And what you see from the 1960s forward is not just a rise in non-marital childbirths across the board, but you also see a rapid decline in shotgun marriages. Right? I mean, people don't even use that term anymore, the shotgun marriage, because at that time there was the idea that if a man and a woman had a child together and they were unmarried, that the man would do the right thing by that woman, make her an honest woman, as people would say, and he would marry her, and they would raise their children together. But now, if there is no longer a moral dimension to that, there's not social pressure applied to the man, and certainly there wouldn't be after a generation after the sexual revolution. And there's a financial backstop, which, in terms of what's advertised, would ensure that those children don't fall into poverty. You have then a dislocation of the man from the family playing the role that God gave him to play, which is at a minimum to provide for his family. As I reminded our intern class recently, God gave Adam a job before he gave him a wife. And in the same way, I think before a man today even thinks about dating anyone, he should have a stable source of income. Right? He should have steady employment, a stable source of transportation. It could be the bus or the train. I grew up in New York, and those are stable enough, and have some place to lay his head. That's the minimum. And starting in the 1960s, again, our policies, our public policy from the federal government undermine a man's ability to do those three things.
And so we've subverted the natural family, and even hearing arguments like, well, actually from a man, I'm not ready to have kids, and so they're going to be better off if I'm not around, so the cultural pressure goes absolutely the wrong direction. So we've talked through a number of these things, so helpful. Again, looking forward to digging into the book to learn more. But let's pivot now into maybe some practical ideas. And we do recognize it's taken a long time to get here. It's going to take some time to get back. But what are some practical ways that church leaders, other committed Christians can say, hey, I want to make a difference in this, maybe starting in their own home, but just some practical thoughts for us?
Yeah, I love what you said where you ended, which is starting in your own home. I think the best thing that Christian couples could do for the future of the family is to model what it looks like for a husband to love his wife and for a wife to respect her husband, right? To model the biblical template for the household. I think that's the best thing. Because one of the things we don't talk about nearly enough as people who are interested in this policy area is we talk about the families that are not formed. We don't talk about the kids who come from, married parents who are pulled into the cultural norms, which is to say sometimes, well, we'll have the child and purchase the home together and then think about marriage sometime down the road. All right? So I think the most important thing that Christian couples can do is to hold the piece of territory that you have. Hold on to your own kids. train them up in the way God requires as it relates to the family. And practically that may mean, when you talk to your children, age appropriate, of course, about one day, if they say, well, one day I want to have kids, it's to constantly reinforce the idea, okay, well, if you want to have children, you need a spouse first, all right? It's to give your children small tasks to do that will align with the roles that they'll need to play in the home. Now, I will acknowledge this is a lot easier to do when you have sons, because if you or I said we're training our sons to be future husbands and fathers, everyone will give us a round of applause. But the minute that you say, particularly if a dad says, I'm training my daughter to be a future wife and a mother, then even many of the church folks will say, well, what exactly does that mean? So there's some asymmetry, in terms of household roles and based on sex. That being said, that's basic that Christian couples can do. I think every church should be thinking about how it can either start or amplify or extend some type of marriage ministry or work with couples who are interested in getting married. So that could be a formalized marriage ministry. It could be pastoral counseling. It could be premarital counseling. It could even be sort of regular date nights for some of the couples within the church. But something that sends a signal that as a church, as a body, as a local body, we are invested in the first institution that God created, which is the family. And we want to do everything that we can to support our fellow members in their endeavor to strengthen their marriages and raise their children. Now, I think churches can do more than that. One of the things that I've written about is the idea, we mentioned it in our recent Heritage Family Report, the marriage boot camp, which for whatever reason the media picked up on and really seems to be very afraid of. But in context, that idea was basically starting with cohabiting couples who share at least one biological child, right? So they've already done some of the things that married couples tend to do, right? They've had children, they live together, and it's about taking them through, a marriage boot camp, but training, marriage and relationship education that I think would be best done by the church. You cover communication, conflict resolution, sex, intimacy, fidelity, money management. And at the end of that program, successful completion means you are now ready to say, I do. You mentioned this a little bit earlier in the conversation. In my vision, it would be a communal wedding, a mass wedding. Invite your family and your friends. You'd be paired with a marriage mentor, so an older couple who's gone through some of the same things that you've gone through. And it would be great if there was a private donor, right? Not public funds, but a private donor who's willing to commit, I don't know, $5,000, $5,000, $10,000 for every couple that completes this successfully. That was the idea that we tried to articulate and the idea that I put in my book, because one of the things that we know but doesn't get enough attention is that cohabitation is on the rise. And in fact, a larger share of American adults today have cohabited than have been married. So this is something that we're going to have to deal with. In fact, in 2022, I believe, about 1 in 5 new home purchases was by an unmarried couple living together. So these are the family dynamics that we find, and I think the church can do things wherever it stands. Some churches may have more resources to take on more, but every church, I think, should be thinking about ways to strengthen the family and to send the signal that, again, marriage is the family is the first institution that God designed. Marriage is the author and designer, God is the author and designer of marriage, and that the entire family flourishes when we do it God's way.
So, Delano, I so appreciate this because it's right according to the focus of our podcast, which is in some ways inverting our political attention. We can have an impact in D.C., and we should, and I'm grateful for great organizations like yours. But most of us are going to have our greatest impact in our own zip code and certainly in our own homes. And I've been encouraged to see kind of across the country a number of the family policy councils, including ours, looking at really pushing marriage ministry in our church networks, trying to make that as easy as possible for churches to add. So I'm really encouraged by that. Now, Heritage has done a lot of work on welfare reform and some things that need to be done there to change that incentive structure, probably a conversation for another time. But looking at something nationally, of course, right now, marriage has in some ways been kind of undefined by the Supreme Court. And so you recently joined a group of very courageous folks to launch what's called the Greater Than campaign. Would you explain maybe just the basics of that? And there's some messaging you've mentioned already that I think is exactly what all of us need to learn and we need to be repeating across the country. So would you maybe explain that campaign?
Yeah, so Greater Than is a campaign being spearheaded by Katie Faust, who's really great on these issues. She founded the nonprofit Them Before Us. And really what it seeks to do is to empower children in many respects and to prioritize the needs and rights of children over the desires of adults. So our thesis is that that every child, every human being is the living embodiment of exactly one man and one woman. And every child has a right to both parents, both biological parents, and that right is best exercised in a loving, low-conflict home with a mom and dad who are married. But the Obergefell decision in 2015 makes that right impossible in many respects, because by the Supreme Court changing the legal definition of marriage, it has opened the door to the redefinition of family. And now same-sex couples, across the country can legally adopt children. They can claim rights to children that they did not produce. Increasingly, they'll be able to claim a right to reproductive technology in order for them to have the family of their dreams. And what the Greater Than campaign says is, in order to get rights right, to put us back on the right track with respect to the family, that we have to overturn Obergefell. And we understand that this is a politically ambitious goal, but we believe it's the right thing to do. All right. So because again, so much of family policy today, to the extent that it's even discussed on the political left, is focused around what the adults want. And that spans everything from abortion, which is framed as all about what women desire, right? So you're not ready to have a child, so just abort the child and go on and live your life. Not about the child's right to life. This is an easy divorce culture, and so when you see the Washington Post writing stories about a woman who's going out to celebrate her divorce, all right, or the Atlantic running stories about a woman who says, I had a great husband and a great family, but I blew it up to find myself, quote unquote. It's about, again, what do the adults want, not what the children need. And it's also in this area that I'm talking about, which is the idea that adults have a right to children that they didn't create. And it's important to and obviously you're a lawyer, so you don't need, this is not for you, but I'm just saying it.
Absolutely.
But rights always come with corresponding obligations. And if I have a right to my property, someone has an obligation not to steal it from me. If I say I have a right to a child that I cannot and have not created, then that means that somebody's obligated to give me a child, either a child that's already been born or the reproductive material or reproductive capacity to create a child. And we think that completely inverts the moral order, because what it does, it imposes on the weak for the benefit of the strong. And we say, no, children have a right. Children have a right to their parents because creation comes with an implied obligation towards stewardship. And that man and woman who create that child have an obligation to care for that child. And we believe that obligation is best carried out within the context of marriage. So that's what Greater Than is about. Again, we completely want to reframe the conversation about the family around what children need and have a right to, and not just what adults desire.
And we're grateful to have Katie on at the beginning of this year. So it's been great to have you on, actually fairly close to one another. And stories like Shu Bo, this man from China, ordering more than 100 children, and just what that does for those kids. And we're entering that wild, wild west of reproductive technology. And so, Delano, what I so appreciate about you is you just look at these biblical principles. You look at what, just practically is working, what's not, and then you just go where that takes you. And it doesn't matter who might oppose that. If it's seen as taboo in culture, you're just going to go after it. And I do believe we flourish if we embrace who God created us to be. That's what this podcast is all about. So as we come to a close, Donna, so many things you've talked through. We'll link to the book. We'll link to the movement as well as to the work of Heritage. But just any summary thoughts, if you had a billboard on which to put a message to the church, be pastors, committed Christians, what would you put on it?
What I would say to the church is that the church should embrace what makes it distinct. Your local nonprofit could run a backpack drive, right? So, a mom and pop shop could, donate to a soup kitchen on the weekend. But what makes the church distinct really is the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. And I think too many churches want to be, are so politically minded that they're no longer of any gospel good. And I think the most important thing for the church is to preach the gospel and believe the Bible and apply it impartially, right? Without not being a respecter of neither person nor party, to apply it impartially across the board, particularly to the things that concern God the most. So that would be my message to the churches. Embrace what makes us distinct, and don't just go along with whatever the culture demands.
That's so good. Delano, thanks again for taking the time. Looking forward to seeing the book come out and all the different projects that you're going to continue to work on. Look forward to staying in contact with you through your work. So thank you again.
Thank you, sir.